Hello everybody, thanks for joining. I am Nat and I will be conducting the Nat stream today. Hello geometric shapes again, Meredith K pseudonym. Hello Tia. Hello Adam Warlock. Hello Middle Earth Marxist. Hello, it's me Crystal. I'm glad you're enjoying the Chopin there. And hello Peppercorn and Spectra Wrestles. Welcome back to Nat Reads Automation and the Future of Work. Hello Blue Vixen. I did manage to read about half of the book last time, so I'm hoping I can actually finish it today. And I'm hoping that's good news for people who didn't maybe catch the first half as well, because I think there's, like, if you want to stick around, obviously you can go check out Sophie's archive channel for the first half, but I think you'll get a clear picture, even if you haven't seen, like, listened along reading the first half with me, because like he's obviously gonna sort of summarize what he said at the end of the book. Oh, I'm just realizing my microphone's all the way up there. This might be a little better. Thanks. Hey y'all. Thank you everyone for coming back. I was really enjoying automation in the future of work, and Sophie's got a video about AI coming up as well, so I think this is like the perfect time for me to read this, because I know it's going to be like very useful to that video, and I know this was really useful to her in writing The World Is Not Ending as well. It's a book that I've been meaning to read for a long time, and it's a very nice short read with a strong argument, so hope everyone's excited. Before I start reading, if at any point during the stream anybody at all happens to be enjoying the stream, you may want to consider helping support the stream by, for example, tipping to contribute to this. Sophie's taking me to France at the end of the month, and she wants to get me, it's my birthday at the end of the month. It is my birthday coming up, so if anybody would like to contribute, that would be much appreciated. We're also going to go see some really cool communists in France, so I'm very excited about that. Can also subscribe or cheer or any of those other things that happen on Twitch. Mysterious ways and wiles. I will start reading now. Chapter 4, A Low Demand for Labour. At the core of the automation discourse is the concept of what economist Wassily Leontief called long-running technological unemployment. So I'm going to distinguish quotes from the text by reading them in a posh voice, because I think that's like easier to tell a little bit what's going on if there's a different voice involved, and that's kind of the voice that I can maintain easiest. So that's how it's going to go. Hello MBND, hope you enjoy. Long-run technological unemployment. Extrapolating from particular instances of automation-induced job loss, theorists claim to have discovered a general phenomenon. In the coming decades, full automation will supposedly lead to full unemployment. Like whale oil and horse labour, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee suggest in The Second Machine Age, human exertion may soon find itself no longer needed in today's economy, even at zero price. Were full automation upon us, the resulting jobs apocalypse would quickly demonstrate that social life had to be reorganized so that waged work was no longer at its center. The past 2 chapters cast doubt on this prediction, yet, like the automation theorists, I too have argued that the world economy is beset by labor under demand. Has this low labour demand been accompanied by rising unemployment rates, as the automation discourse suggests it should have? Across the advanced capitalist economies, unemployment rates rose rapidly after the 2008 crisis, yet over the 2010s, those rates fell, although at a much slower pace than in the wake of past recessions. In 2020, unemployment levels spiked again due to the COVID-19 recession. In the US, they rose at unprecedented speeds. But that had little to do with automation. If the past is any guide to the future, unemployment levels will likely fall again, albeit at a slow pace over the coming decade. Such data hardly fits with an account of rising long-run technological employment, but this should not be taken as evidence that the demand for labour has not declined. Under the pressure of decelerating economic growth, the mode in which labour under demand expresses itself has shifted from unemployment to a variety of forms of chronic underemployment, which are more difficult to measure. As many commentators have already recognised, we are heading toward a good jobless future rather than a jobless one. Workers typically lack the reserves that would allow them to live for long without earning a labour-based income. As automation theorist and former presidential contender Andrew Yang argues, workers have to keep working in order to feed themselves so they take any jobs in sight, including jobs offering poor pay, limited hours, or terrible working conditions. Fanboy is trans boy. Good timing. I've just started. Automation theorists like Yang interpret this trend as a consequence of growing technological unemployment occurring somewhere off stage. In reality, rapid automation has hardly taken place at all, off stage or anywhere else. Still, rates of job creation have fallen over the past half-century, primarily due to ongoing slowdowns in average rates of economic growth. This has made it more difficult for workers who lose their jobs in the midst of downturns to find equivalent forms of work during the weak recoveries that follow. Many are discouraged from looking for work at all. Governments have generally responded to this persistently low demand for labour not by prompting work sharing among the employed, but rather by reducing workers' access to unemployment benefits, pushing job losers to take whatever work was available, even at the cost of lost wages and degraded skills. And the sort of language that I've heard around this from people talking about past recessions is disciplining the workforce. So when there's a recession, lots of people lose their jobs, and at first governments might respond with stimulus packages, but they often ultimately respond by disciplining the workforce back into work for less, by reducing benefits, by otherwise making being unemployed completely intolerable, to force people into taking jobs with fewer hours, worse conditions, and basically just accepting less. Working at any cost. Starting in the 1970s, unemployment rates in wealthy countries began to rise from historically low levels. Outside of the United States, they remained stubbornly high for decades. In that context, unemployment insurance programs went into crisis. They had been designed for short bouts of cyclical unemployment in fast-growing economies, not long-term unemployment in stagnating economies. To coax the unemployed back to work, governments began to reduce labour market protections and scale back unemployment benefits. Active labour market policies replaced passive income support systems as the main response to job loss. In Denmark and Sweden, governments tried to balance inducements to work by spending almost 1% of GDP in 2016 on placement services, training programs, and employer incentives, but they achieved mediocre results in slow-growing economies. In most wealthy countries, such programs were even less in evidence. Spending on active labour market policies, not including direct job creation, averaged just 0.3% of GDP in OECD countries in that same year. Under these conditions, few workers remain unemployed for long. No matter how bad labour market conditions become, they still have to try to find work, since they need to earn an income in order to live. As growing numbers of workers find themselves without reserves, the present-day world economy comes to look more like the one Marx analysed in the mid-19th century in Capital. In a stagnant economy, Marx explained, the stagnant portion of capitalism's industrial reserve army, or relative surplus population, will tend to grow. Recruited from workers in large-scale industry and agriculture who have become redundant, this stagnant surplus population comes to form a self-reproducing and self-perpetuating element of the working class, which takes a proportionally greater part in the general increase of that class than the other elements. So many quotes here. Since their work is characterized by a maximum of working time and a minimum of wages, their conditions of life tend to sink below the average normal level. The expansion of this population was, for Marx, an absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. Written over 150 years ago, Marx's analysis has become contemporary once again. In the slow-growing economies of the past few decades, job losers have been obliged to join new labour market entrants in low-quality jobs, earning less than normal wages in worse than average working conditions. Unlike in Marx's time, this phenomenon is mediated today by post-war welfare state institutions, which have continued to shape labour market outcomes even as those institutions have deteriorated over time. Cross-country institutional differences determine the degree to which experiences of precariousness diffuse through the workforce or remain concentrated within specific sections of the population. Such shifts are easiest to document in the United States, where only unionized workers are afforded basic employment protections. Almost all other employees are hired at will and, barring outright discrimination, can be fired at any time. Between 1974 and 2019, unemployment rates were on average 30% higher than they were between 1948 and 1973, primarily due to lower rates of job creation following recessions. Over the same period, private sector unionization rates declined significantly, from nearly 30% in the early 1970s to 6% in 2019. Firms were therefore able to take advantage of higher average unemployment rates, which left many workers fearing for their jobs, to put the squeeze on the employees. Given the difficulty many workers would face finding new work were they fired from their jobs, they have been compelled to accept relatively stagnant real wages as the condition of working at all. Some economists have argued, on the contrary, that over the past few decades, it is only US workers without college degrees who have truly faced deteriorating labour market conditions. In a less extreme version of the automation thesis, these economists claim that technological change has hollowed out the American job market, destroyed middle-wage jobs, and polarized employment opportunities between high and low-wage work. The automation of routine tasks is said to have generated a rising college wage premium, setting off a race between education and the machines. It is certainly true that, in the United States, experiences of precariousness are strongly modulated for individual workers by education levels as well as race. Unemployment levels in the United States are significantly higher for workers with low educational attainments and for people of colour. It is also true that, in the 1980s and early 90s, some Americans were able to insulate themselves from downward pressure on wages by getting a college degree. However, by the early 2000s, when the automation of economic activity was supposed to be accelerating, the college wage premium had stabilized, since the wages of most college-educated workers had begun to stagnate. The median American college-educated worker earned a lower real wage in 2018 than in 2000, even though the total value of outstanding student loans rose dramatically over those years. The reason is that from 2000 on, economic growth rates slowed significantly, and so too rates of job creation, while college degrees became more common. 40% of prime-aged workers had at least a college degree in 2019. Those degrees offered less protection from deteriorating labour market conditions. Workers with college degrees crowded out workers with lower levels of educational attainment in jobs that did not previously require such degrees. Meanwhile, the share of young college-educated workers with employer-sponsored healthcare halved, from 61% in 1989 to 31% in 2012. Despite earning higher wages than their less educated counterparts, many of these workers were precariously employed. Hello, Mad Dog Idaho. Hello, Matt J. Crowley. Hello, Cedar Rit, sorry. Hello, Jenny Bodied. Hope everyone is enjoying the stream. And if anybody would like to consider supporting the stream, we'd really appreciate little tips and subscribes and cheers. And I see that Yacht has tipped. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jenny Bodied, who's tipped as well. That's really, really generous. Thank you. And Crystal 4, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Hello, Ashrand! Very, very cool to have you back for this stream. Right, where'd we get to? Where'd we get to? What makes the United States unusual from an international comparative perspective is precisely that experiences of economic precariousness diffuse throughout the workforce. Even regularly employed US workers find that they are highly exposed to potential job loss in a persistently low labour demand economy, since they can be fired at any time. The consequence is that, unlike firms in other countries, US firms face no particular need to construct alternative working arrangements to take advantage of vulnerable sections of the labour force. Some firms do utilise alternative working arrangements to get around US labour law. Witness the small but significant boom in gig economy jobs like Uber and Lyft, which offer work through online platforms as a way of disguising their employees as independent contractors. But when all is said and done, just 10% of US workers are employed in such arrangements in 2017, including as independent contractors, on-call workers, temp agency workers, and fixed contract workers. Set against this American case, the employment landscape in European and wealthy East Asian countries is more complicated. In these regions, post-war labour market institutions were mostly designed not by left-wing governments, but by right-wing politicians who emphasised the importance of national imperial identities, the formation of male breadwinner households, and the maintenance of relatively fixed workplace hierarchies. In return for accepting corporatist arrangements, male heads of households received substantial job protections. Unlike in the United States, regularly employed workers were not hired and fired at will. For a crude measure of the difference that has made, we can look to the OECD Index of Employment Protection Levels, which measures, on a scale of 0 to 6, the degree to which employees are protected from individual firings. Permanent workers in the US barely register at all on this index, at 0.5, while workers in the UK at 1.2, Japan 1.6, Germany 2.5, Italy 2.5, and France 2.6 have been much more protected. In the latter countries, heads of households who obtained permanent jobs were largely insulated from market pressures associated with a declining demand for labour. They remained free to fight for collective wage increases, even as economy-wide unemployment rates rose to 10% or more. Meanwhile, as compared to the US, unemployed workers in these countries received more generous out-of-work benefits. In most high-income countries, rising rates of unemployment from the mid-1970s onward therefore did not initially cause workers' real wages to stagnate, as in the United States. The workers who suffered most were the unemployed, as well as the children and spouses of still employed workers. The job crisis took the form of a worsening exclusion. It was concentrated on specific sectors of the population rather than widely diffused. Older unemployed workers were pushed into early retirement. Married women were discouraged from looking for work, which is why women's labour force participation rates remained low in many European countries, and Japan, with Sweden as a key exception, into the 2000s. Given employees stronger holds over the jobs they possessed, European and East Asian firms needed to secure institutional changes in employment relations in order to take advantage of low levels of labour demand. Responding to pressure from employers, governments stripped job losers and new labour market entrants of employment protections by coaxing them into so-called non-standard job categories as part-time, temporary, or otherwise contractually limited employees. Some of these categories, like mini-jobs in Germany, had previously been de facto reserved for housewives and were meant to serve as a secondary source of income. but have since grown to become primary sources of income for many households. Compared to workers on standard employment contracts, non-standard workers have fewer employment protections. The term precarity entered a wider lexicon precisely amid protests against laws that reduce job security for many workers, particularly for women and youth. So, for example, in the UK, we literally have, they pushed up the age at which young people could be paid a lower minimum wage than older people. I'm just checking, reminding myself. So in the UK right now, there's a minimum wage for 16 to 17-year-olds, which is £5.28 per hour. 18 to 20-year-olds, which is £7.49 per hour. And there's a 21 to 22-year-old rate, which is £10.18 per hour. And the national living wage is £10.42 per hour. For 23 plus, it's got marked there. So it's like they've literally created these more stratified wage rates so that they can maintain these more exploitable classes of labourers. Why does the government get to come in and say that a 20-year-old doing the same job as a 22-year-old can be paid like £3 less per hour? That doesn't make much sense to me, except as a demand for exploitation of labor. For instance, the 2003 Biagi law allowed Italian firms greater flexibility in firing part-time and temporary workers. The 2004 Hartz IV reforms substantially reduced out-of-work benefits in Germany. Similar efforts to strip young labour market entrants of employment security in France were rebuffed by workers in 2006 and again in 2016. Yet, despite bouts of resistance, labour markets in Western Europe and wealthy East Asia have become steadily more bifurcated between workers in standard employment with relative job security and a growing mass of mostly younger workers in non-standard jobs who lack it. Between 1985 and 2013, the share of non-standard employment in total employment rose from 21% to 34% in France, from 25% to 39% in Germany, from 29% to 40% in Italy, and from 30% to 34% in the UK. In Japan, the non-regular employment share, a category similar to the non-standard employment share, rose from 17% in 1986 to 34% in 2008, with similar trends unfolding in South Korea. Changes in the composition of employment were much more dramatic for new job offerings. 60% of jobs created in OECD countries in the 1990s and 2000s were non-standard. 60%, that's massive. Ashwan says, and they get to do that because capitalism is created and maintained by state action. It creates new underclasses as needed. Yes, true, correct. Thank you very much for that contribution. More and more workers were exposed to employment insecurity at a time when, due to slowing rates of job creation in anemic economies, they would have trouble finding new employment were they to lose their jobs. These workers were forced to moderate their demands for wage increases. Across the OECD, real median wages rose by 0.8% per year between 1995 and 2013, even though labour productivity rose by 1.5% per year, leading to a significant upward redistribution of income, although one that was less intense than in the United States alone, where those rates were 0.5% and 1.8% respectively. Surplus labour on the world scale. The Global South presents a mixture of European and American-style cases, but taken to greater extremes than on either side of the Atlantic. On the one hand, post-war and post-colonial development states generally adopted labour laws that were similar to, or even stronger than, those operating domestically in former European metropoles. Turning to the OECD Employment Protection Index, once again shows that in Argentina at 2.1, Brazil at 1.8, and South Africa 2.1, permanent workers on standard employment contracts have had stronger employment protections than equivalent workers in the UK, 1.2, while in China at 3.3, India 3.5, Thailand 3.3, and Tunisia 2.7, such workers have been more protected than even equivalent workers in France, 2.6. On the other hand, few workers have access to protected jobs, which are generally found only in government offices and large-scale industrial plants. So the vast majority of workers across the Global South have been forced to find employment instead in a variety of non-standard jobs, where they have fewer protections than the least protected US workers. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the expansion of non-standard employment became a major problem well before the onset of labour's global deindustrialization. In the 1950s and 60s, the demand for work had already far outstripped its supply, as rapidly expanding non-agricultural workforces searched for jobs in slow-growing import substitution industries. To describe the burgeoning populations of urban street sellers, micro-manufacturers, and bicycle-based transport services they encountered, labour force statisticians developed a new category of informal sector employment. In the 1980s and 1990s, informal sectors expanded considerably as country after country adopted disastrous market-opening structural adjustment policies at a time of heightened international competition. Workers who lost their formerly contracted jobs at large-scale enterprises and government offices, or saw their salaries slashed, were forced to join new labour market entrants in working informally, during what was, in many countries, a time of nearly unending economic crisis. Meanwhile, to take advantage of growing labour surpluses, firms schemed to replace protected formal employees with informal workers, while at the same time lobbying governments to reduce formal job protections as a stimulus to economic recovery. Unlike most other Global South countries, China saw rapid economic growth in the 1980s and 1990s, yet China's economy relied more heavily on the creation of legally disadvantaged categories of workers than any other country. The non-Minggong, working in urban centres but registered in rural areas, were categorically denied employment protections offered to other urban workers. Sewing shirts and assembling electronics in export-oriented manufacturing establishments, these workers were forced to relinquish any thought of demanding higher real wages, since their job security was so low and competition for their jobs was so high. The expansion of non-standard employment has exposed gigantic numbers of people to intense job insecurity worldwide. Workers are especially insecure in Global South regions, insofar as they mostly lack access to even rudimentary legal protections and unemployment benefits. Worldwide, barely 1/5 of unemployed workers received unemployment benefits in 2012. Therefore, workers had to find new sources of income as quickly as possible when they lost jobs. With the result that the global unemployment rate was just 4.9% in 2019, despite a widely recognized dearth of job opportunities. Most workers who've lost their jobs have had to work informally. In fact, according to the International Labour Organization, only 26% of the global workforce had permanent employment of any kind in 2015. Only 26%. Whether full or part-time, leaving 74% to work either for employers on temporary contracts or else informally, without a contract, but for an employer or on their own account. In this regard, the term non-standard employment is clearly a misnomer, the residue of a mid-20th century dream of full employment that never became a global reality, least of all in the parts of the world where most people live. What that means in practice is that, with the exception of a tiny minority of protected employees, workers around the world find themselves highly exposed to the ebbs and flows of the demand for labour. In an era of generally low labour demand, many workers fear that were they to lose their current jobs, they would have trouble finding new ones, since there are already so many other workers just like them, with their same skills and aptitudes, who are unemployed or underemployed and looking for work. Facing job insecurity, these workers are forced to accept relatively stagnant wages and poor working conditions. This condition is not primarily the result of recent developments in computer technologies. Instead, it follows from decades of overcapacity and underinvestment, which ran down the economic growth engine of the world economy, and did so at a time when global labour forces were still expanding. Unless there is a drastic shift in state policy, the COVID-19 recession will only intensify these trends in the years to come. Post-industrial doldrums. Unemployment levels have risen substantially due to the COVID-19 recession. However, given the shifts in labour market regimes documented above, this unemployment will likely resolve itself over time into a variety of forms of underemployment. Unable to remain out of work for long, people will find that they have no choice but to take jobs offering lower than normal wages, or worse than normal working conditions. Those who cannot find any work at all will set up shop in the informal sector, or else will drop out of the labour force entirely. Life in stagnant economies has come to be defined by intense employment insecurity, all the worse in recession years like 2020, which has been artfully represented in recent science fiction dystopias populated by a redundant humanity. Most people are scraping by, earning additional minutes of life one at a time, while the richest asset owners have amassed such large quantities of capital that they are endowed with the monetary equivalent of immortality. Since they cannot remain unemployed, what kinds of work do these surplus workers do? From the mid-60s onward, as labour surpluses expanded globally, multinational firms began to engage in labour market arbitrage, playing suppliers off each other to obtain productive labour at low prices, which they then used to compete in oversupplied global markets. Industrial firms have taken advantage of employment insecurity not only in thousands of export processing zones in low-income countries around the world, but also in the high-income countries, where they have moderated workers' wage demands by creating multi-tiered contracts or hiring workers outside the bounds of standard labour law. Yet only about 17% of the global labour force works in manufacturing, with an additional 5% in mining, transportation, and utilities. The vast majority of the world's underemployed workers therefore end up employed in the heterogeneous service sector, which accounts for between 70 and 80% of total employment in high-income countries and the majority of workers in Iran, Nigeria, Turkey, the Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. The post-industrial economy we have inherited, finally, on a world scale, is, however, rather unlike the one whose emergence the American sociologist Daniel Bell first predicted in 1973. Instead of an economy of researchers, tennis instructors, and Michelin-rated chefs, ours is predominantly one of side street barbers, domestic servants, fruit cart vendors, and Walmart shelf stackers. The basic pattern of employment growth in services was best described by Princeton economist William Baumol in the 1960s. His theory helps explain why underemployment in the sector has been such a major feature of the 21st century economy, and why the automation theorists' accounts fall askew. Baumol explained rising service sector employment by pointing out that service occupations typically see much lower rates of productivity growth than the industrial sector. Services generally do not exhibit dynamic patterns of expansion, with output growing faster than productivity, which in turn grows faster than employment, as was the case in manufacturing before 1973. Instead, most output growth in services is generated by expanding employment. Echoing at a distance Marx's concept of the stagnant relative surplus population, Baumol argues that services come to form a relatively stagnant economic sector. There is a clear link between the global expansion of this stagnant economic sector and the ever-worsening stagnation of the world economy. In fact, to say so is merely to reiterate that following the onset of labor's global deindustrialization, nothing, including the expansion of service sector employment, has proven capable of serving as an adequate replacement for the economy's formerly robust industrial economic growth engine. Perhaps we need an economic system that doesn't rely on infinite growth, which is implausible and bad as an idea for the world. That services are not amenable to the incremental process innovations that generate rapid rates of productivity growth is hardly an inherent feature of services as such. In many service activities, impediments to raising productivity levels have been overcome, but precisely by industrializing them. As sociologist Jonathan Gershony has argued, these services were transformed into goods for self-service in households. The washing machine substituting for laundry services, the safety razor for barbershop shaving, the motor car for public transport. Rendered via industrial processes, these goods-embodied services then became amenable to dynamic efficiency gains. The activities that remain services today are those that have proven resistant to such industrialization, due to resistances that have not as yet been resolved. It is certainly possible that, like apparel sewing and electronics assembly in industry, additional service activities will prove amenable to technological breakthroughs in the digital age, making it possible to transform them into self-service goods, rendered via ever more efficient industrial processes. Witness, for example, the recent disappearance of travel agencies. However, it would be a grave mistake to imagine that the main barriers to dynamic economic growth in our times were merely technical, and that they could be overcome through technological leaps that transformed stagnant services into dynamic industries. The primary barrier remains the redundancy of technical capacities around the world, making for crowded global markets in which output rises slowly across all lines of production. Many mass-produced industrial products have come online since the start of labour's global deindustrialisation in the 1970s. For instance, a large variety of consumer electronics. But if anything, these newer industries have suffered from worse overcapacity than older ones. The same fate would befall any self-service goods derived from present-day service activities. Then, as now, job losers and labour market entrants would be forced to look for work in whatever activities remain open, taking advantage of a key feature of those activities that makes them choice sites for underemployment. Ashwin says, worth noting the labour surplus in the 60s and 80s, 60s to 80s, was more accurately described as a commodity surplus. Productivity had increased to the point that costs had to go down to compete. This is the tendency to the rate of profit to fall that neoliberalism largely serves in opposition to. Yeah. Since services cannot rely on price effects for expansion of demand, that is, rising productivity leading to falling prices and hence to increased demand, we should expect service sector employment to grow slowly over time. As Baumol showed, service sector prices suffer from a cost disease. Sluggish rates of productivity growth mean that services become ever more expensive relative to goods. Service sector demand must therefore rely on income effects for its expansion. The growth of demand for services depends on the growth of incomes across the wider economy. However, this means that as the rate of overall economic growth slows, with the dilapidation of the industrial growth machine, the pace of service sector employment growth should slacken too. And it generally has, across the advanced capitalist countries. But despite advanced economies' slower growth, service sector employment expanded steadily in certain occupations, in which legal institutional frameworks had allowed for the hiring of precarious labour. It is precisely at this point that the logics of underemployment come into play. It turns out to be possible to lower the prices of some services, and so to expand demand for them in spite of overall economic stagnation without raising corresponding levels of productivity. That is, by paying workers less or by suppressing the growth of their wages relative to whatever meagre increases in their productivity are achieved over time. Since difficulties in raising rates of productivity growth in these services are persistent, employers are incentivized to exert further downward pressure on wages, either to keep up with their competitors or to race ahead of them. The same principle applies to self-employed workers who, by offering to work for less, are able to create demand for their labor at the expense of their incomes. The service sector is the choice site for job creation through such superexploitation, because the wages of service workers make up a relatively large share of the final price that consumers pay. Since labour productivity levels tend to be lower in services, it is often possible for small-scale family operations to compete with highly capitalised firms, as long as the former are successful in pushing their incomes down to a minimum. Particularly in low and medium income countries, productivity growth in many services has been negative, as people contrive to work for themselves via involuntary job creation strategies. The extent to which firms are allowed to take advantage of income-insecure workers to generate immiserating forms of work, then, depends on the strength of each country's labour protection laws. As we have seen, countries have generally intervened in low labour demand economies to reduce those protections. In fact, that was the explicit goal of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, itself, which has been a consistent advocate of labour flexibility as the way to bring down unemployment rates. By the late 1980s, OECD economists had come to recognise that, given slower economic growth rates, firms were unlikely to invest sufficiently to increase the capital stock in line with what was required to generate new high productivity, high wage jobs. It therefore seemed inescapable that a reasonably rapid growth of employment would require the creation of many jobs which use a below average amount of capital to support them, and for which, in consequence, the supportable real wage would be correspondingly modest. Looking to the United States, where unemployment rates fell because the average real wage of new jobs was held below the average real wage of existing jobs, the OECD began to advocate this perverse job creation strategy everywhere. OECD economists could never have foreseen that the period of economic stagnation would last this long. However, they should have predicted the socially dislocating effects that would follow from this policy. Ashwan says, I keep pushing down on one side of the scale. It shouldn't matter that I'm standing on the other side. I want it to go down. As underemployment rises, inequality must intensify. Masses of people can only work as long as the growth of their incomes is suppressed relative to the average rate of economic growth. Relative to the average rate of income growth. As economists David Autor and Anna Salomons note, labour displacement need not imply a decline in employment, hours, or wages, but can hide itself in the relative immiseration of the working class as the wage bill, that is, the product of hours of work and wages per hour, rises less rapidly than does value added. The consequence is to further expand the gap between the average growth rate of real wages and of productivity levels, contributing to the 9 percentage point shift from labour to capital incomes in the G20 countries over the past 50 years. Worldwide, the labour share of income fell by 5 percentage points between 1980 and the mid-2000s, as a growing portion of income growth was captured by a tiny class of wealth holders. As I discussed earlier, increases in inequality have been worse than even those statistics suggest, since the distribution of labour income has itself become more unequal, with the largest pay raises going to managers. Between the late 1980s and the early 2010s, labour productivity grew faster than average wages, which in turn grew faster than median wages across the OECD. Over time, immiserating employment growth becomes self-reinforcing. Sectors of the economy expand by taking advantage of pools of underemployed labour and then come to depend on their continued availability. As thoughtfully depicted in Bong Joon-ho's award-winning 2019 film Parasite, pew 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 pew, fucking great film, it begins to make sense for high net worth and managerial households to hire working class households to perform more of the tasks they would otherwise do for themselves, as tutors, domestic servants, drivers, childminders, and personal assistants, simply due to large differences in the prices of their respective labours. These trends suggest that the apocalyptic crisis of labour market dysfunction anticipated by automation theorists will not take place. Instead, unemployment will continue to spike during downturns, as we are seeing happening once again and on a truly massive scale in the present COVID-19 recession. Then, in the course of the tepid boom periods that follow, this unemployment will slowly but surely resolve itself into higher levels of underemployment and rising inequality. In The Rise of the Robots, futurist Martin Ford says that his worst nightmare would be if the economic system eventually manages to adapt to the new reality of labour displacement. But in truth, it has. As Mike Davis put it, the late capitalist triage of humanity has already taken place. Unless halted by concerted political action, the coming decades are likely to see more of the same. Overcapacity in international markets for agricultural and industrial products will continue to push workers out of those sectors and into services, which will see their share of global employment climb from 50% today to 70 or 80% by mid-century. Since overall rates of economic growth are set to remain low, the service sector will absorb job losers and new labour market entrants only by increasing income inequality, leading us further and further into the post-industrial doldrums. This is not to say that the poor will get poorer. In fact, the share of the world's population suffering from the most extreme forms of poverty has declined over time, alongside the urbanization of the world's population. However, poorer workers' share of overall income growth remains much smaller than their share of the population. As economist Thomas Piketty and his colleagues have shown, incomes for the poorest half of the global population doubled between 1980 and 2016, though rising by only a tiny amount in absolute terms. But that accounted for only 12% of overall income growth. The richest 1% captured more than twice that share, 27%, over the same period. As inequality has risen, social mobility has fallen. Whether workers as home health aides in Minnesota, adjunct university lecturers in Italy, fruit vendors in Tunisia, or construction workers in India, more and more people feel that they are stuck in place. Young labour entrants earn incomes that could never support independent households, especially where rents are rising quickly. They are often unable to move out of their parents' homes and start families. Taking on debt in an effort to get ahead, they find that repaying their loans absorbs a large portion of their wages, since their incomes remain relatively stagnant over time. To struggle against the labour market forces that are making people so miserable would require a substantial shift in labour's capacity to press its interests. Yet, over time, the organised sector of the labour force has receded. Ah, it's Joe! Joe! Ashran says oversupply of agricultural products combined with an increase in population just implies a global famine, by the way, no big deal. An interesting contrast is that if the real value of assets goes down as fast or faster than inflation, the labour share of income increases. Neoliberalism also exists to prevent this. Yeah, that's why they always freak out over inflation, which they move to decrease inflation, and what they mean by that is lower labour's wages. And the effect has been to hold wages lower than they would be otherwise. Yeah. I'm glad you're hooting and hollering, Jay. Jay. Where to get to? Oh, by the way, anyone watching, if anybody happens to be enjoying the stream, do feel free to contribute to the stream, which will also be contributing to my birthday plans at the end of the month. Yay! So Nat's birthday. I'm gonna be a 31-year-old lady. Woo, 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 woo. All right. Where to get to? To struggle against the labour market forces that are making people so miserable would require a substantial shift in labour's capacity to press its interests. Yet over time, the organised sector of the labour force has receded. Union density across the OECD declined from 30% of the workforce in 1985 to 16% in 2016. The share of workers covered by collective bargaining fell from 45% to 32% over the same period. Global union density fell even lower, weighing in at approximately 7% in 2014. Under these conditions, the containment of economic inequality has come to depend more and more on the strength and generosity of welfare state institutions. However, these two have tended to give way in the face of economic stagnation. In sluggish economies periodically racked by austerity, it is easier to blame the resulting social deterioration on vulnerable sections of the workforce, immigrants, women, racial and religious minorities, than to unite around a new emancipatory social project. Hello, new unknowns! I'm like 2 seats to Joe's left right now. Okay, who's new unknowns? Somebody in the warehouse, I guess. Abby, hello. Guess do not go there. Howdy. Okay, chapter 5, Silver Bullets. Look at us go. There's only 2 chapters left. Look, that's... Well done. You read... That's most of a book already. Everybody, you've already listened to most of the whole book. That's so cool. Whoa. Chapter 5, Silver Bullets? Question mark. The automation discourse has identified a set of troubling tendencies in the world economy associated with a persistently low demand for labour. Vaudrella, hello! The social crisis entailed by this long unfolding trend has been worse than the statistics indicate. Growing numbers have found themselves excluded from meaningful participation in the economy and from the sense of agency and purpose that it affords, as limited as that may be under the adverse conditions of capitalist societies. Atomization, amplified by job insecurity and inequality, renders people susceptible to the appeal of economic nationalism, which claims to solve globalization's problems by putting our country first. Automation theorists are attentive to the dangers of nationalist solutions. A chronically low demand for labour will not be alleviated by tariff barriers or walled borders. Measured against the catastrophes of the present era, such bromides offer little hope. What other solutions are available? The automation theorists step into this breach like travellers from another time or planet, offering a radical rethink. In this respect, automation is a lot like global warming. When people take it seriously, they find themselves willing to consider revisions to the basic nature of structure of social life that they otherwise would have thought impossible. Naming the present world as obsolete allows automation theorists to boldly explore new, thought-provoking proposals for resolving the crisis of the world of work. These proposals are worth considering, even if, as I have been arguing, they are wrong about the causes of the crisis. In evaluating the automation theorists' recommendations, it is crucial to recall that today's persistently low demand for labour finds its true cause in decades of industrial overcapacity and the underinvestment to which it gives rise. A real solution must resolve this key issue. Keynesianism reloaded. To put the automation theorists' proposals into context, it is worthwhile to begin by considering one option they all dismiss, namely Keynesian interventions to induce higher levels of fixed capital investment with the goal of soaking up the global labour surplus. As the automation theorists have described it, the world's labour crisis cannot be resolved by Keynesian means. Job-destroying technical change, if it took the form of full automation, would be a problem no matter how fast the economy were growing. Since the low demand for labour is actually due to ongoing technological change in the midst of a persistent economic slowdown, Keynesian economic stimulus should be effective, were it possible to significantly raise economic growth rates on that basis. Why not take the Keynesian plunge? The truth is that governments in most high-income countries never stopped diving down that chasm. Scholars tend to think of the 1970s as the end of the Keynesian era, but in many ways it was just the beginning. During the quarter century following the end of World War II, Keynesian counter-cyclical spending was actually little in evidence. Instead of spending beyond their means, governments used the opportunity of galloping economic growth rates to reduce debt burdens they had incurred during the war. Between 1946 and 1974, the UK reduced its public debt to GDP ratio from 270% to just 52%, all while investing in education, healthcare, housing, transportation, and communication infrastructures. Across the G20 countries, government debt to GDP ratios fell from 107% to 23% over the same period. This evidence hardly supports the view that full employment, when and where it was achieved in the post-war era, was the result of Keynesian demand stimulus. Instead, as I have argued in previous chapters, rapid post-war industrial expansion generated a consistently high and stable demand for labour largely on its own. Public spending on education, healthcare, and infrastructural development did not stimulate private investment. The former could barely keep up with the latter's needs. More productive capacity came online after the end of World War II than ever before in world history. But precisely for that reason, international markets for manufacturers quickly began to suffer from overcapacity, issuing a reduced pace of capital accumulation and falling rates of output growth. The replication of technical capacities across the world undermined the conditions for further rapid expansion. The result was wave after wave of deindustrialization and a persistently low labour demand. The era of counter-cyclical spending began in earnest in the 1970s, precisely in response to capital's disinvestment from the economy. Governments spent gigantic sums of money in an effort to induce additional investment. Between 1974 and 2019, public debt to GDP ratios correspondingly rose across G20 countries, from 23% to 103%. In some countries, such as the United States, 107%, Italy, 135%, and Japan, 237%, debt to GDP ratios in 2019 were even higher. With the exception of the UK, where debt levels stabilised from 1980 to 2007, states exhibited no tendency to wean themselves off deficit spending during the neoliberal era. policymakers abandoned full employment as their goal, but facing ever more anemic economies, governments continued to take on large quantities of debt during downturns, only to find it difficult to raise additional tax revenue during the weak upturns that followed. The failure of debt-driven spending to stimulate high rates of economic growth should be all the more surprising from a Keynesian perspective, given that long-term interest rates simultaneously fell to near zero. Falling interest rates should have encouraged investment in fixed capital. Buoyed by ultra-low interest rates, debt levels did rise dramatically among financial and non-financial corporations, as well as private households. Total debt, both public and private, rose to record levels of 383% GDP in the mature economies in 2019 and 322% of GDP worldwide, before the COVID-19 recession hit. Yet in spite of enormous debt accumulations, average annual economic growth rates continued to decelerate across the OECD from 5.7% in the 1960s to 3.6% in the 1970s, 3% in the 1980s, 2.6% in the 1990s, and 1.9% from 2000 to 2019. Companies turned to debt financing not to invest in new fixed capital, but rather to engage in mergers and acquisitions, or to buy back their own stocks. In absence of any viable alternative to the industrial growth engine, the stimulation of demand has induced less and less new private investment. That bodes poorly for COVID-19 stimulus packages. Like their predecessors, they too will fail to encourage a new wave of capital accumulation. In the absence of a revival of economic growth, states are likely to reimpose austerity once the pandemic ends. Yeah, that's what's happened. That's what's happened, exactly like that, since he wrote this book quite recently. Instead of trying to restart the growth engine via Keynesian stimulus, we need to rethink the framework we use to allocate people to production. Keynes himself would have agreed with that aim, although not with the means required to get there. As capital accumulates up to the point where it ceases to be scarce, Keynes argued profit rates will fall to low levels, leading to the onset of a period of economic maturity which Keynes's American counterpart Alvin Hansen called secular stagnation. Harvard economist Larry Summers has recently received the secular stagnation thesis. Recently revived the secular stagnation thesis. He now claims that the austerity-induced structural reform he previously advocated is unlikely to lead the economy to health. Instead, he argues, only massive public investment can restore full employment. Keynes would have agreed with the need for greater public investment, but he would have argued further that the onset of economic maturity was an indication that the capitalist era was drawing to a close. Under conditions of economic maturity, Keynes said it would make more sense to intervene to shrink the labour supply rather than to stimulate labour demand, in increasing leisure rather than output. Given a long-term decline in returns to private investment, Keynes suggested the work week might have been reduced to 15 hours, and even that was only to satisfy the old Adam in us, that is, the need to feel useful. Many economists misinterpret Keynes's vision as a quixotic prediction about workers' preferences with regard to future productivity gains, as if Keynes were saying that in the future, workers' stated preference for increased vacation time rather than rising wages would cause working hours to shrink over the course of 3 generations. By contrast, radical Keynesians, like British economists Joan Robinson and William Beveridge, knew that to get to the post-scarcity world of Keynes's dreams, it would be necessary to socialise investment levels and legislate shorter working days. Yes, 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 work less. That's lit. Everyone fucking work less. Beveridge's 1944 plan for full employment in a free society, which he released shortly after his design for the British National Health Service met with public acclaim, proposed to do just that. Beveridge budgeted for 22 more years of capitalist development after the end of World War II, 2 years for a transition from war to peace, and 20 years of reconstruction, during which public investment would be mobilised to defeat the 4 social evils of want, disease, ignorance, and squalor. On this advanced social foundation, he argued, the state could begin to wind down the economy sometime in the late 1960s, increasing leisure to reduce weekly hours of work and favouring an equitable distribution of income to reduce levels of economic inequality. Add to this programme a planned transition from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, and Beveridge's proposal would rival the most radical designs for a Green New Deal today. Of course, governments never seriously considered implementing Beveridge's full employment proposal. Examining the reasons for the failure of the radical Keynesian projects of the past shows why similar plans will hardly fare better today. In the aftermath of World War II, proposed public investment-led full employment programs were forcefully combated and soundly defeated at a time when left-wing organizations were much stronger than they are today. Of course, most of those left-wing organizations were fighting for more than public investment. Many were calling for the socialization of production. Large asset owners understood correctly that public investments posed an existential threat to their prerogatives regarding where and how much of society's resources to invest in the expansion of production, and hence whether economies would expand or slide into recessions. It was not so much full employment they feared, but rather full employment achieved via public investment, which would have neutralized the capacity of large asset owners to throw society into chaos through threats of disinvestment. Throughout the post-war period and into the present, capitalists have ensured that they retained a tight grip over this heavy artillery of class conflict, the capital strike. The capital strike. Fucking Ayn Rand shit. Because the Atlas Shrugged, the alternative name for Atlas Shrugged that she had was the strike, and it's, you know, it's capitalists going on strike, going like, look how you like it. But of course, capitalists don't actually work, so the capital strike looks like starving masses of people on purpose. By threatening to disinvest, capitalists have ensured that the private investment decisions of large firms are respected as the condition of maintaining or restoring high levels of employment. Today, firms' grip over the capital strike weapon is stronger than it was before, since investment levels are depressed and underemployment is widespread. Moreover, in a world where private investment is weak, fear that public investment could displace its private equivalent as the main driver of economic activity becomes all the stronger, since so little investment is taking place overall. It is a mistake to imagine that capitalists would ever agree to their own planned obsolescence. To challenge capitalists' control over investment decisions, even under the guise of a New Deal-style capital-labor accord, is not a compromise, as Oscar Lange pointed out in 1938. To retain private property and private enterprise and to force them to do things different from those required by the pursuit of a maximum profit would involve a terrific amount of regimentation of investment, upsetting the financial structure of modern capitalist industry, and encouraging firms to use their economic power to defy the government authorities, for instance, by closing their plants, withdrawing investment, or other kinds of sabotage. Ashran says capital strike is what we got in the 70s that ushered in neoliberalism. Interesting, that makes sense. That makes sense. We're bringing together all the pieces with Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. Thank you for the tip, Vaudrella. Really appreciate it. If anybody else happens to be enjoying the stream, feeling like they're learning, please feel free to contribute to the maintaining of the stream and my birthday at the end of the month. There's tips, there's sharing, subscribing, all the Twitch things that you can do. And if you're watching on the archive channel, I'm speaking to you right now, archive channel listeners, of which I anticipate there will be some, because obviously some people will be wanting to go back and catch the first stream before entertaining the second half. Also feel free to send us a little tip. Hello, Othesius1. Good to see you here. I'm reading Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. Hello, little Cringe30. Thank you very much for subscribing with Prime. Facing potential insubordination from powerful actors, radical Keynesians would need to threaten firms with full socialization. In order to make good on those threats, they would need to have already developed and disseminated a clear plan for doing away with private enterprise. But then, to have any chance of securing their aims, radical Keynesians would also need to have won the backing of major social movements. Only movements that presented a truly existential threat to asset owners' wealth would be able to bring capital to heel. Yet if those social movements were powerful enough to force capital to submit to a public investment-driven economy, why would they not demand more? This is why Sophie always says, if workers' movements and radical movements are powerful enough to pressure governments to offer UBI, we say, no, fuck you, we want everything. We want fucking everything. Just gonna say that again. But then to have any chance of securing their aims, radical Keynesians would also need to have won the backing of major social movements. Only movements that presented a truly existential threat to asset owners' wealth would be able to bring capital to heel. Yet, if those social movements were powerful enough to force capital to submit to a public investment-driven economy, why would they not demand more? Such movements would not willingly allow for power's further concentration in the hands of the state. Instead, they would demand a devolution of power to democratic organs of the people themselves. As we will see, automation theorists' UBI proposals suffer from a similar failure to reckon with the weapons capital wields, above all, in an era of economic slowdowns. Capital disinvestment neuters all worker-empowering policies as soon as they are born. Free money. Like the radical Keynesians, the automation theorists want to wind down the economy. However, they propose a different way to get there. not by raising levels of public investment and legislating a progressive reduction in the work week, but rather by distributing no strings attached incomes to every citizen without exception. Set at a high enough level, this universal basic income would end poverty outright. It would also provide workers in insecure employment with a measure of security, a crucial reform in an era of mass underemployment. Advocates argue that UBI would also do much more, renewing society at a deeply moral level, by showing that there is a shared investment in each individual's thriving. A UBI would restore our sense of social solidarity. Governments in Spain and Scotland, as well as Democrats in the United States, have been weighing the idea of implementing emergency minimal UBI programs due to COVID-19, which could then be made permanent once the pandemic ends. Did they fuck? No, obviously not. Obviously, those programs were not made permanent. In a country like the United States, where racism birthed welfare programs that treat the poor with suspicion, if not contempt, a transition from means-tested benefits to universal ones would be a welcome move toward justice in itself. Meanwhile, in lower-income regions such as sub-Saharan Africa, UBI could make possible new welfare programs to service the poor without requiring states to build complex means-testing infrastructures. Debates within the UBI camp concern whether UBI payments should be higher or lower, whether they should be taxed back from high-income earners, whether they should supplement or replace other welfare state programs, and whether they should be extended widely or restricted to citizens. For automation theorists, UBI resolves the central conundrum of their vision: how to provide people with an income to price their preferences in a world where human labour has been rendered largely or even fully obsolete. UBI is the technical solution that transforms the nightmare scenario of automation into the dream of post-scarcity. On this basis, automation theorists often present UBI as a neutral policy instrument, appealing to left and right, that solves the problem of global and underemployment, just as the Green Revolution technologies were supposed to solve the problem of global hunger. There is an inner affinity between technological determinism, which is the core of the automation discourse, and its recourse to technocratic solutions. Both positions elide difficult social and political questions by transforming them into putatively objective facts. Such technocratic neutrality is a fantasy, depending on the manner in which it is implemented. UBI will lead in radically different directions, most of which will not bring us closer to a world of human flourishing. A critique of the automation discourse's market-based vision of post-scarcity will help reveal the contours of a non-market alternative. UBI proposals long predate the advent of the automation discourse. Some trace their origin to Thomas Paine, who suggested as early as 1797 that a lump sum payment should be distributed to all individuals on reaching the age of maturity. Paine justified this coming-of-age grant along classically Lockean lines, arguing that all land had originally been held in common, but had since been divided up into parcels of private property. Rising generations were therefore unable to access their fair share of humanity's inheritance. For Paine, coming-of-age grants could serve as the cash equivalent of each person's share in the common stock of the earth, and thus enable everyone to participate in the world of private property. In his proposal, which anticipates the concept of basic income, payments are not a way to create a post-scarcity world, but rather to secure the moral foundations of a private ownership society. 20th century neoliberal economists supported a basic income for similar reasons. Both Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman advocated for UBI in the form of a negative income tax as a replacement for welfare programs. Instead of funding public projects aimed at reducing poverty, people should be given enough money to raise them above the poverty line. This proposal was a piece of Friedman's larger neoliberal worldview. Instead of trying to resolve market failures by supplementing private activity with public activity, public education, healthcare, housing, regulations on pollution, and so forth, Friedman argued that states should bring more aspects of life within the purview of the price mechanism. He saw the market as the very foundation of freedom, responsibility, and self-respect. On this view, the poor did not need public assistance. They needed money so that they could re-immerse themselves in markets. Today, the most fulsome right-wing arguments for UBI are to be found in the writings of the infamous racist and social critic Charles Murray. Infamous racist social critic Charles Murray, who has taken up Friedman's baton. In Murray's view, UBI would not only end poverty, he believes it will also halt the decline of the West, restoring its tired souls to Christian faith and monogamous marriage. Murray is responsible for the idea that UBI should be set at $1,000 per month, a sum chosen not because it would allow individuals to meet their basic needs, but rather because it represents the current cost of welfare state programs. Murray's proposal is simply to liquidate the present-day welfare state and distribute its funds directly to the population as handouts. As is typical of many recent books by advocates of UBI, the latest edition of Murray's In Our Hands does say that UBI is needed now more than ever as a response to automation. But in truth, Murray's advocacy of UBI is only loosely based on the automation discourse. His advocacy of UBI stems from his belief that welfare state institutions are not only economically inefficient, but soul-destroying. They entail the alienation to the state of essential sources of individual meaning-making, with the result that people neither know nor care for one another, and that they cannot truly be happy. Murray argues instead that social problems like poverty and drug addiction need to be handled directly by the communities in which they arise through voluntary associations, ensconced in moral worlds of faith and community values. I'm just like, voluntary associations from Charles Murray sounds an awful lot like people need to be allowed to be racist and homophobic, etc., but let's carry on. UBI would support the formation of such associations by dismantling the institutions that presently shoulder these burdens and by providing individuals with a social wage to free up their time. A key feature of this right-wing proposal is that it is in no way designed to combat economic inequality. Murray suggests that further income redistribution be blocked by constitutional amendment so that inequality could continue to rise after a UBI program had been implemented. Murray's proposal for UBI is a disturbing vision of how an ever more unequal society, marked by a persistently low demand for labour, might render this situation palatable to the poorer among its members, while at the same time freeing well-heeled market participants to enrich themselves without limit. A clear danger is that in its implementation, UBI will come to look more like this right-wing version than it does left-wing alternatives. And indeed, Murray's version of UBI is the one most discussed in Silicon Valley. Correspondingly, it is also the one that inspires most of the automation theorists discussed in this book. What then about the left-wing alternatives? One key difference is that the latter would be much more expensive, because they would aim to provide people with enough money to support a modicum of a good life. From a centre-left egalitarian position, Philip Van Parijs, perhaps UBI's most widely respected advocate, wants to provide people with enough money to meet their basic needs without dismantling the welfare state. He and Yannick van der Bot aim at 25% of GDP per capita, roughly $40,000 annually per household in the United States. To make this palatable, they recommend starting payments at a modest level and not on a universal basis. Instead of busting down the political front door, UBI will likely have to enter through the back door, they say, with a participation condition such as a community service requirement and eligibility restrictions to prevent selective immigration to UBI countries. This is another thing. Like this is the left-wing version of what he's describing, or I guess kind of centre-left. And it for governments to be thinking about this necessarily imposes like requirements on citizens and harsher, more horrific border controls. Like the closest thing that we have to these proposals that exists now is Gulf states that have massive oil wealth and distribute in like large volumes of wealth among citizens, but then all of the labor is carried out by basically a slave class of immigrants who can have their passports withheld and be forced to labor under horrific conditions. That's like an extremely likely set of circumstances for any imperial core country considering like seriously implementing UBI. Left-wing proponents of UBI claim that small beginnings presage big future wins in freedom, since even a modest monthly payment will begin to revitalize communities. I remember thinking that. Their argument, therefore, mirrors its right-wing counterpart. Both suggest that with the extension of UBI, voluntary associations will flourish. The difference between the left and the right versions of this argument is that the right envisions proliferating churches and Rotary clubs, whereas the left envisions a strengthening of worker or consumer cooperatives and trade unions, as well as of collective care organisations and community gardens. Hello, Tux Potatomo. Hello, thank you for subscribing. We are reading Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. Yeah. Let's get to it. Where to get to? Tato is easiest, thank you. If anybody happens to be enjoying the stream, please do consider, even you watching on the archive channel, yes, you specifically, do consider paying for the stream. Can leave a little tip, leave a little tip there, can subscribe, and you can share and do all those other good Twitch things. By organising the unorganised, low levels of UBI, provide the social basis for a powerful push for higher levels of UBI, or alternatively, higher wages, and hence for greater levels of overall economic equality. left-wing proponents of the automation discourse take this UBI proposal and push it to extremes. For anti-capitalist automation theorists like Nick Srinachek and Alex Williams, a high UBI is precisely what is needed to facilitate a shift toward full unemployment. Basing their argument on an article co-authored by a younger, more radical Van Paris titled A Capitalist Road to Communism, Srinachek and Williams claim that as automation advances, the value of UBI should grow until the power to purchase all goods and services is provided by this alternative distribution mechanism. That would not only mark a radical advance in equality, at its limit, it would lead to life beyond wage labour. In their Inventing the Future, UBI accomplishes even more. Acting as a red wedge, it becomes a way to accelerate the transition to a fully automated world. A high minimum income floor empowers workers to refuse work, which in turn incentivizes employers to make jobs enjoyable or to automate them out of existence. UBI becomes a means not of stabilizing the late capitalist economy, but of pushing toward a post-scarcity world in which the economic problem has been solved and people are free to pursue their passions. Past that point, the major questions concern humanity's ultimate horizon. Does freedom from work mean indulging in hobbies, as Keynes imagined? Or does it mean building spaceships and exploring the stars, as depicted in the science fiction novels of Iain M. Banks? Limitations. In its liberal egalitarian forms, UBI has many attractive aspects. Even a minimal net redistribution can be welcomed on its own terms. Above all, if it goes some way to alleviate the stress of poverty and its associated mental and physical ailments. Combined with a global carbon tax, UBI could play a role in mitigating climate change, freeing us to cleave toward a carbon-neutral economy without worrying about the balance of jobs gained and lost in the course of a harrowing energy transition. To evolve from a technocratic fix to an emancipatory social project, however, UBI would have to empower individuals to fight for dramatic and lasting social change. There are reasons to doubt that UBI will have that effect. Let's begin with the flourishing communities that UBI proponents invoke. On the grounds of analytic consistency alone, the right-wing version of this argument makes more sense than the left. According to the right-wing advocates of UBI, bonds of social solidarity have been broken because human powers were alienated to start institutions. Dismantling the welfare state should encourage those bonds to reform. By contrast, the left has always argued that the alienation of human powers to capital is at least as important as their alienation to the state. After all, most of our needs are served today not by public bureaucracies, but by private ones. Gigantic firms produce a myriad of goods for consumption by discrete household units. Modes of transportation, communication, nourishment, and entertainment have all been transformed in line with this inner logic of the market. People spend hours a day in traffic on their way to or from work, together but fundamentally alone, sitting in their cars, eating McDonald's, and scrolling through cat videos on their phone. Social media apps were supposed to solve the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation, but studies have shown that they only make that problem worse. In densely populated urban areas, COVID-19 pushed this capitalist logic to the extreme. Individuals retreated into their homes, ordering whatever household items they needed online, while powerful companies set about reorganizing supply chains and mobilizing masses of workers whose jobs suddenly involved substantial new and under-remunerated risks for contactless delivery. As these examples underscore, economies that are already designed to reduce everyone to an As these examples underscore, economies that are already designed to reduce everyone to atomic existence could easily accommodate UBI. What of the further claim that UBI would empower workers in confrontations with their bosses? In fact, this is putting the cart before the horse. To win a UBI large enough to alter social relations, workers would first need to be empowered. A deeper concern is that even if UBI did give people a greater capacity to stand and fight, it is not clear that it presents a viable pathway toward broader emancipatory goals. For UBI to serve as the basis of a left-wing vision of exit from capitalism, the automation theorist's analysis would need to be correct. Today's low labour demand would have to originate in rapidly rising productivity levels associated with a fast pace of economic change. Were that the case, the main issue society would confront would be one of reorganising distribution, not production, with rising economic inequality rectified by distributing more and more income as UBI payments. But if, as I have argued, contemporary underdemand for labour is the result of global overcapacity and depressed investment, driving down the rates of economic growth, then such distributional struggle would quickly become a zero-sum conflict between labour and capital, blocking or at least dramatically slowing progress toward a freer future. As such, we would need a plan for wresting control of the economy away from asset owners. Yet, UBI proposals say little about how to reduce capital's sway over production. While UBI has the laudable goal of separating the income people earn from the amount of work they do, it would do nothing to alter the relation between income and assets, keeping us tethered to a system in which a sizable fraction of total income derives from interest, from extending credit, rent from leasing land or homes, and profit from running businesses. In other words, UBI would empower workers without disempowering capital, providing people more autonomy in the fulfillment of their animal functions, but no greater role in shaping the wider social conditions under which they do so. The profit motive would therefore remain the driving force of the economy, since large asset owners would retain their power over investment decisions, which would continue to determine whether the economy grows or shrinks. Here, radical advocates of UBI would confront the same impasse as the radical Keynesians. Capital would continue to wield the weapon of the capital strike, the prerogative of owners of capital to throw society into chaos via disinvestment and capital flight. Lots of headlines flashing past my mind and constant arguments in the news. No, you can't increase the minimum wage. Capital will flee. Capitalists will go somewhere else. For 40 years, in an environment of worsening overcapacity and slowing economic growth, capitalists have threatened the use of this weapon to force political parties and trade unions alike to capitulate to their demands. For looser business regulations, laxer labour laws, slower growing or stagnant wages, and in the midst of economic crisis, private bailouts and public austerity. A left that wants to use UBI to usher in a different sort of world would therefore need to present us with its Meidner plan. Meidner plan. DEI. Bringing about the progressive socialization of the means of production via a planned transfer of asset ownership to society at large. The problem is that it was precisely the threat of capital disinvestment during the crisis of the 1970s that led to the abandonment of the original Meidner plan in Sweden. Such a plan would be even harder to realise today, when mass working class organisations are much weaker and economic growth slower. A capital strike against efforts to raise a modest UBI to a higher level would quickly push the economy into crisis, forcing UBI advocates to press forward toward the post-scarcity world long before they were ready to make the leap, or else to back down. Facing such a salto mortale, if anyone knows what salto mortale means, that would be great. Reform parties typically have blinked. For this reason, it is much easier to imagine that a UBI would stabilise at a low level as a support of an ever more stagnant and unequal society built around private property than that it would serve as a planetary highway to a world of free giving. I'm going to Google what salto mortale means. A dangerous and daring jump with possibly lethal outcome. Nice. The ubiquitous decline in aggregate labour demand around the world, especially when combined with imminent environmental threats, has made it impossible to outgrow, economically speaking, the world's surplus labour problem. At the same time, slowing rates of economic growth, which underpins this problem in the first place, have resulted in a situation in which capitalists fight ferociously against any reforms that threaten their control over investment decisions. This is the world we have inherited, and it is where our political reflections must begin. Only a conquest of production, which finally succeeds in wresting the power to control investment decisions away from capitalists, hence rendering the capital strike inoperative, can clear the way for us to advance toward a post-scarcity future. Yo, look at this last chapter. We are nailing it. We are absolutely nailing this last chapter of a whole freaking book. Look at us go. Actually, saying that, I'm gonna go wee right now. I'm just gonna go for a little wee. I'm gonna bring back the lovely Chopin that you can enjoy whilst I'm out weeing, and then I'll come back and I'll read the last chapter for all you lovely chatters. Aren't you lucky? Lovely. All right, let's get to it. Chapter 6. If anyone happens to be enjoying the stream, feels like they're learning something with us, do feel free to consider contributing to the stream with a little tip or a little subscription or a little cheer. All right, let's get to it. Chapter 6. Necessity and freedom. Even if one doubts automation theorists' accounts of technological progress, as I certainly do, their attempts to imagine and chart a path toward a post-scarcity future remains their thought's most attractive aspect, because it allows us to pose the question of how the pieces of this defunct world can be reassembled into a new mode of social existence. Harbouring such a vision is crucial if we are to revive an emancipatory project today, not least because its future realisation seems so far away. 19th century socialists knew they were far from achieving their goals, but they were nevertheless possessed by an idea of a freer future, which animated their struggle and the risks they took in its name. As late as 1939, poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht could still write, "Our goal lay far in the distance. It was clearly visible." Few would say that today. Not only are we living in an era of stubbornly entrenched neoliberalism, provoking angry ethno-nationalism and climate-induced catastrophes of growing frequency and scale, we also lack a concrete idea of a real alternative. Central planning turned out to be both economically irrational and ecologically destructive, filling warehouses with shoddy products and proving susceptible to autocratic bureaucratization. European welfare states and Keynesian full employment policies proved unable to adapt to a context of slowing growth and ongoing deindustrialization. Meanwhile, against the attacks of neoliberals, social movements have mostly mustered rearguard defences, which will merely slow our slide into the abyss. So, demand the future indeed. But which one? It is striking that Star Trek: The Next Generation provides the go-to example of a freer future for so many automation theorists. In this series reboot, launched in the late 1980s, a technology called the replicator, essentially a highly advanced three-dimensional printer, brings about the end of economic scarcity, allowing people to live in a world without money or markets. Citizen scientists are then free to explore the galaxy, boldly going where no one has gone before, without having to worry about how they are going to earn a living. The question is, can we envisage a post-scarcity world without the replicator? That is, even if full automation turns out to be a dream. By focusing on technological progress rather than the conquest of production, automation theorists end up largely abandoning what has been seen as the basic precondition for generating a post-scarcity world from Thomas More's 1516 utopia to present-day Trekonomics. This precondition is not the free distribution of money, as the most recent wave of automation theorists have it, but rather the abolition of private property and monetary exchange in favour of planned cooperation. Pew, 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 pew. One of the reasons they relinquish this key objective is that they begin from the wrong transitional questions. They start from the assumption that full automation will be achieved, going on to ask how we would need to transform society in order to save humanity from mass joblessness and create a world of generalized human dignity. It is possible to reverse this thought experiment. Instead of presupposing a fully automated economy and imagining the possibilities for a better and freer world created out of it, we could begin from a world of generalized human dignity, and then consider the technical changes needed to realize that world. The post-scarcity tradition. What if everyone suddenly had access to enough healthcare, education, and welfare to reach their full potential? A world of fully capacitated individuals would be one in which every single person could look forward to developing their interests and abilities with full social support. What would have to change in the present for this future scenario to materialise? In a fully capacitated world, everyone's passions would be equally worthy of pursuit. Particular individuals would not be assigned to collect garbage, wash dishes, mind children, till the soil, or assemble electronics for their entire lives, just so others could be free to do as they please. Instead of pushing some people down under the mudsill in order to raise up the rest, as the South Carolina slave owner James Henry Hammond once put it, we would need to find another way to allocate the necessary labours that serve as the foundation for all our other activities. Ashran says, I'm sorry you've not been able to watch this stream because of internet failure. I will upload this to the archive channel later, and the first part of this book is also up there for anyone who wants to catch up or catch both. Whereas automation theorists place their hopes in technology, many of the original theorists of post-scarcity, such as Karl Marx, Thomas More, Etienne Cabet, and Peter Kropotkin, did not need to call on a deus ex machina to solve this riddle. They claimed that post-scarcity was possible without the automation of production. Instead, they argued, we need to reorganize social life into two separate but interrelated spheres, a realm of necessity and a realm of freedom. The distinction between those two realms comes from ancient Greece, although for Aristotle, this distinction was one between persons. Slaves were condemned to the realm of necessity, while only citizens were allowed to enter the realm of freedom. Aristotle was himself a reverse automation theorist, justifying slavery by reference to the absence of self-moving machines. If every tool, when summoned, or even of its own accord, could do the work that befits it, he said, then there would be no need either of apprentices for the master workers or of slaves for the lords. For Aristotle, the absence of such machines made servitude unavoidable. Although his vision was not devoid of slaves who were adorned with golden chains, More transformed this division between classes into a division internal to the life of each individual, drawing inspiration from Plato's Republic and the early Christians, who lived according to the principle of omnia sunt communia, or everything held in common. More had the inhabitants of his imagined island utopia abolish money and private property. Wherever there's private property and everything is measured in terms of money, he explained, it is hardly possible for the common good to be served with justice and prosperity unless we think justice is served when all the best things go to the worst people, or that happiness is possible when everything is shared among very few, who themselves are not entirely happy, while the rest are plunged in misery. Living in a time of early agrarian capitalism, More was disgusted by the enclosures by which farmers were stripped of their possessions, circumvented by fraud, or overcome by force, in order to make way for the pasturing of sheep. Left with no option but to steal their daily bread, I would say, not in order to make way for the pasturing of sheep. I've been reading Caliban and the Witch, to force people to labour for the ruling class. When people, the enclosures were not carried out because the ruling class had need for so much land, had desire for the resources of that land. The resource that they were trying to take was people's labour, and by removing the people from their land that they could subsist on communally, they could force people to labour for them and for capital. And then they exported that process around the world through colonialism. Left with no option but to steal their daily bread, poor people were imprisoned or summarily executed. Actually, in this during the enclosures, the ruling class would set up like meager bread dole lines, and they would position gallows right next to them for everyone queuing for food to beg back the product of their labor that had been taken from them by the ruling class, then given back to them with the constant threat that, believing that they deserved any more than the pittance that was given back to them that they had produced, would result in death and humiliation and torture. Instead of this patently absurd and cruel system in which some were condemned to poverty and death so that others might be wealthy, More advocated the pooling of necessary labours in common and the opening up of a realm of freedom for all to enjoy. Indeed, in Utopia, the Commonwealth is primarily designed to relieve all the citizens from as much bodily labour as possible, so that they can devote their time to the freedom and cultivation of the mind. The class of idlers, Aristotle's free men, would be disbanded, so that everyone could have a share of idle time for themselves. Almost 300 years later, these ideas inspired the exiled Rousseauian Republican Etienne Cabet, who read More's Utopia in the British Museum and was immediately converted to the social ideal of post-scarcity. He wrote his own treatise, titled Travels in Icaria, 1840, advocating for what he called the community of goods. To More's call for the abolition of money and private property, Cabet added the application of advanced machinery to reduce the extent of the labours of necessity. These were the ideas that inspired the French communists of the early 1840s, to whom Marx turned when he outgrew the liberal republicanism of his youth. Marx condemned the French egalitarian communists, the followers of Francois Noël Babeuf, for their asceticism. He rarely referred directly to Cabet, who had become a Christian mystic by the time Marx and Engels penned the Communist Manifesto. Nevertheless, Marx saw it fit to lift the famous slogan that would grace the communist banner. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his need. Un bibium, this reminds me of the old Latvian joke. Part of the setup includes the assumption that a farmer can have all the potatoes they want. Any Irish person should have stopped the joke right there. From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Good one. It's a good one. I like that one. Many of Marx's post-scarcity ideas are derived from his Moreist predecessors. Marx then went beyond More and Cabet in charging that the post-scarcity world in which these thinkers aimed could only be achieved through mass action. It would not be handed down from on high by a wise lawgiver, as was the case in visions of Plato, More, Rousseau, and Cabet. None of that idealism. We're here for the materialism. In the brief life of the Commune, workers invented new modes of democratic self-government, replacing periodically elected officials with immediately recallable delegates. Exiles from the defeated commune, including Elie Reclus, later roamed Europe, coming into contact with revolutionaries like Peter Kropotkin, who went on to write detailed accounts of how democratically organised post-scarcity societies could be constructed. Kropotkin emphasised the role of voluntary associations in post-scarcity life. He argued that voluntary associations would flourish in a world where money and private property had been abolished and necessary labours were pooled in common. These ideas were taken up in various guises by Otto Neurath, the original target of the socialist calculation debate, and by thinkers as diverse as W.E.B. Du Bois, John Dewey, and Karl Polanyi. All advocated for a world in which democratic associations of women and men replaced the rule of markets with cooperative production, and taking advantage of capitalist technologies, reduced the common labours of necessity to expand a realm of individual freedoms. Dubois estimated that in the future industrial democracy, just 3 to 6 hours of necessary labour per person would suffice, leaving abundant time for leisure, exercise, study, and avocations. Instead of making some engage in menial service so that others might make art, he said, we would all be artists and all serve. To many people, this vision of post-scarcity was what socialism and communism had come to mean, before their later identification with Stalinist central planning and breakneck industrialization. I will take each component of this vision in turn in order to sketch an account of how, on the basis of a conquest of production, fully capacitated individuals might solve the contemporary problem of persistent under-demand in a socially emancipatory direction. Cooperative justice. In the realm of necessity, we would share out the labours necessary for our collective reproduction, which form the condition of possibility of everything else we want to do. The precise extent of these labours would not be determined a priori, and so would need to be decided democratically, but would include the provision of all the goods and services necessary to make a life, the provision of housing, food, clothing, common intermediate and final goods, sanitation, water, electricity, healthcare, education, child and elder care, means of both communication and transportation, and so on. Theorists of post-scarcity generally estimate that these common labours would take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a day, about 1/3 to 1/2 of a standard work week, although this work could be concentrated in certain positions of each week or in specific years of life. Besides labour hours, other measures could also be used for social accounting. We would divide up responsibilities while taking into account individual aptitudes and proclivities. Some tasks would need to be performed locally, but many could be planned on a regional or global scale using advanced computer technologies. Of course, much necessary work is difficult to share out widely because it requires specialised skills. We would still need farmers, construction workers, surgeons, electricians, and machinists, though in a fully capacitated world, these specialisms would themselves be more evenly distributed. Utopian writer Edward Bellamy proposed one way to organise the division of labour in a post-scarcity society in his novel Looking Backward, 1888. There, the supply and demand for labour determine how many hours people work rather than how high a salary they earn. Skilled work is rewarded with a lesser labour contribution rather than higher pay, while the performance of risky or especially difficult labours earn an honorific, a kind of celebrity. As across societies today, which differ in their institutional preferences for general education or vocational training, there need not be a single solution to this problem. as long as the division of labour neither leaves important tasks undone nor reproduces an elite class of technicians. I'm liking it. I'm liking it. How are we liking it? How are we liking this? He's saying so much of things that I've thought before, which is cool, and so loads of new ones, which is even cooler. The result of such work sharing would be that more people, including those currently cast aside as redundant workers, would participate in necessary work so that the amount any one person had to do would be correspondingly reduced. Allowances would obviously be made for the differently abled, as well as to let everyone take long periods off of work entirely, for rest, for travel, for grief, or for cultural immersion. In order to share such necessary labours at all, their character would need to be dramatically transformed. Social distinctions between waged and unwaged work, which have historically consigned women to the hidden abode of household production, would have to be abandoned. Moreover, production and consumption would need to be conceived of as a closed loop. Moreover, production and consumption would need to be conceived as a closed loop rather than endpoints cut off from each other, cut off from other social, ecological considerations. Coordination among fabricators, farmers, cooks, cleaners, engineers, and artists could then become the basis of new forms of communal luxury. There's an ad starting in 52 seconds. That's so annoying. So annoying. Go away, ad. Okay, it's snoozed for 5 minutes. That's hardly any time at all. 5 minutes? That's ridiculous. I shall carry on. Once this initial metamorphosis is complete, the question remains as to how a fully capacitated humanity might further transform their common labours. Here it is important to recall that technologies developed in capitalist societies are not neutral. They are designed to embody capitalist control, not to free humanity from drudgery. Nevertheless, we already have the technical wherewithal to make many tasks more enjoyable than they currently are. Rather than serving the uses of an owner class, such know-how might instead be applied to break down distinctions between skilled and unskilled labour, or to eliminate some kinds of labour altogether. In any case, such questions would be settled by human beings' collective determination of what they want to do, rather than decided for us by supposedly unstoppable technological forces. Instead of seeking to end our obligations to one another, which for automation theorists serves as the foundation of a world of generalized human dignity, the point would be to recognize and transform those obligations. To say so is not to champion the work ethic. It is to recognize that a free existence can be achieved right now, even if drudgery has not, and never will go away. Disalienating community life, by taking that life under democratic control and collective care, becomes the way to ensure that individual freedom is shared by all. Note that what I am here calling necessary or reproductive labour is not necessarily unsatisfying, especially if it is apportioned in such a way that no one's life is entirely dominated by it. Minding children, for example, is not only good for children, but for adults too, opening them to the wonders of a child's experience of the world. Likewise, making dinner or washing dishes, when done collectively, can facilitate the formation or deepening of relationships, and when done alone, may help us get out of our heads. Whether a fully capacitated humanity would prefer such activities to be performed by food replicators or cleaning drones, so that people can get on with their scientific research unimpeded, remains to be seen. In the post-scarcity tradition, the reorganization of necessary labour makes possible a world of free giving. Everyone can go to the social storehouses and service centres to get what they need, while, as Moore put it, giving absolutely nothing in exchange. All are therefore entitled to food, drink, clothes, housing, healthcare, education, means of transportation and communication, and so on, irrespective of their contribution to the labour of necessity. Just as all men are entitled to warm themselves in the heat of the sun. I like that a lot. I like that quote. That's great. Although ecological sustainability would set constraints on their provision. People could hop on a train, stop in at the local canteen, get their teeth cleaned, drop off children at the daycare, enroll in vocational courses, or find a place to sleep for the night without having to prove that they qualify for access. There would be no possibility of excluding someone from these social goods. For a post-scarcity society to come into being, a literal cornucopia is not required. It is only necessary that scarcity and its accompanying mentality be overcome, so that people can live, as Moore said, with a joyful and tranquil frame of mind, with no worries about making a living. According to this perspective, abundance is not a technological threshold to be crossed. Instead, abundance is a social relationship, based on the principle that the means of one's existence will never be at stake in any of one's relationships. The steadfast security that such a principle implies is what allows all people to ask, "What am I going to do with the time I am alive?" rather than, "How am I going to keep living?" Some will choose to follow a single idea to its end, others to periodically reinvent themselves. The main choice people will have to make is how to balance the goal of bettering oneself against the injunction to better humanity. As Captain Picard of the Starship Enterprise tells a financial mogul who had been cryogenically frozen in the 21st century, only to be revived, to his horror, in a post-scarcity world. Ashran says, "I am always fascinated by the history of the automat in this context, like we uninvented them just so capitalism could have more servants in it." What's the automat, Ashran? That sounds fascinating. In such a world, there could still be sanctions to ensure that necessary work is actually undertaken. However, inducements to work would not take the form of threats of starvation, but invitations to cooperate. Economists have long recognized that hunger and homelessness are not the best motivators. Even in Kropotkin's time, economists admitted that the best situation for man is when he produces in freedom, has choice in his occupations, has no overseer to impede him, and when he sees his work bring a profit to himself and others like him. Oh, there's an ad. There's an ad. Ugh. People didn't even hear that bit, because there's an ad. Ugh. Aren't they like diners with prepared meals, snacks that you could retrieve by inserting money into the slot from which you take it? Okay, since there's an ad, well, the ad's just finished now. Okay, I'm looking up automats. An automat is a fast food restaurant where simple foods and drinks are served by vending machines, and typically there's no wait staff. An automat is basically a sit-down meal vending machine. So you look at all the cooked meals on display, put your money in the one you want, and the glass door opens so you can buy it, at which point it's reloaded from behind. Right. Yeah, I always felt like kind of a more ideal, like, shared eating space to replace, like, restaurants. Because obviously there's so many different kinds of extremely unpleasant work involved in restaurants that, like, you know, wouldn't need to be done if everyone could choose what they did in a more equal society. Would be a more, like, canteen style kitchen, like shared space. So you've got these kind of more kind of pre-prepared meals that you can just select from. Yeah. Apologies if I'm just rereading a section right now. I just want to make sure people caught the last little bit. However, inducements to work would not take the form of threats of starvation, but invitations to cooperate. Economists have long recognized that hunger and homelessness are not the best motivators. Even in Kropotkin's time, economists admitted that the best situation for man is when he produces in freedom, has choice in his occupations, has no overseer to impede him, and when he sees his work bring a profit to himself and others like him. Ashran says, I know so many chefs who love being chefs. I know exactly 0 wait staff who love their job. Yeah, that's kind of it, right? Like, I literally, like, I've done kitchen porter work and I've done wait staff work, and I much prefer, like, washing dishes to, like, serving people at the tables. It's simply the worst. But obviously, in a socialist post-scarcity society, which is achievable with the means that we have right now, the dishes could be shared a little more gently. A lot more gently. A best-selling writer on motivation recently rediscovered these same ideas. Feelings of autonomy, mastery, and purpose are what generate the best work, not higher levels of monetary reward. It's funny how these ideas need to be rediscovered over and over and over again, almost like there's a lot of effort and pressure put into making sure that people don't get to express them and share them. The successful organization of a post-scarcity world would require that its denizens solve to their satisfaction the problems posed by the 20th century's socialist calculation debates. They would do so with the tools of the 21st century, utilizing digital technologies to coordinate their needs and activities by designing algorithms which process data and present alternatives, and protocols which structure decisions about alternatives that could be further modified and adapted over time in light of experience. Individuals would be able to use digital applications to articulate their needs and to transmit these to associations, while associations in turn would need to be able both to allocate resources among themselves and to figure out how to make do with the resources they are able to acquire in a way that was fair and rational. Efficiency would no longer be an overriding goal of production, but producers would still have to be able to make reasonable choices among production techniques based on the ease with which they can access different sorts of supplies. It would have to be possible as well to hold producers accountable were they to fail to meet democratically determined social standards. Again, there is likely to be no single best way to deal with these crucial problems. Ashran says, I made this point during COVID lockdowns, but we don't actually need wait staff. Capitalism just loves making servants repeatedly. See also TaskRabbit. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all these efforts can simply, like, it's actually easier and more pleasant to, like, go up to a place where maybe food has already been prepared, or maybe you can participate in preparing your own food and take it down to sit and eat, and then even go up and wash your own dish. Singular, simple, easy, nice. Many options. Such potential. Free time for everyone. For theorists of post-scarcity, the reconstruction of the realm of necessity is not an end in itself. The solidarity it engenders also expands the realm of freedom and ensures that this too is shared by all. Once necessity is assured, everyone is free to develop their individuality outside the bounds of any given community. The point is to enable, by way of a collective social project, what the automation theorists hope to achieve technologically, although advanced technologies will certainly play a role in expanding freedom's purview. Of course, the realm of freedom is about having time for both socializing and solitude, for engaging in hobbies and doing nothing at all. Rien faire comme une bête, lying on water and looking peacefully at the sky. That was a quote, I should have done it in a posh voice. Rien faire comme une bête, lying on the water and looking peacefully at the sky. Yeah, sounds pretty sweet. I'm just gonna Google what that French bit was, because it's also a like pivotal point or card in the video game Half-Earth Socialism, which I will probably play on stream sometime soon, and it's very cool and neat, and like it places you in the position of a like single world ruler, and obviously that's like silly and fictional, but it's just to allow you to go through the exercise of looking at what kind of collective decisions people can make to take care of themselves whilst facing off climate change. Take care of each other. Bien faire comme une bête. Hell yeah. It means do nothing like a beast. Beautiful. That's what I want. Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodor Adorno's phrase is suggestive of a world in which material dispossession and the existential insecurity to which it gives rise have been universally abolished. None of this requires that we assume a spontaneous harmony of interests or a benign human nature. On the contrary, an end to economic compulsions implies that many people will be free to withdraw from oppressive personal relationships within households or workplaces, or to renegotiate the terms of those engagements. What will people do with their expanded free time? Post-scarcity has been called post-work, but such framing is inadequate. After a period of rest and recovery, even the most work-weary people become restless and look for something to do. The reorganization of social life to reduce the role of necessary labor is not, therefore, about overcoming work as such. It is about freeing people to pursue activities that cannot be described simply as either work or leisure. That might include painting murals, learning languages, building water slides, or discovering new ways to do common tasks to make them less time-consuming. It could mean writing novels or self-reinvention through education or exploration. As automation theorists of both right and left envisage, the end of scarcity would enable people to enter voluntary associations with others from all over the globe, to join consortia of mathematical researchers, clubs for inventing new musical instruments, or federations for building spaceships. For most people, this would be the first time in their lives that they could enter truly voluntary agreements without the gun to their heads of a pervasive material insecurity. Geometric Shape says, time to get home from work, have a good stream, Nat. Can't wait to rewatch both vids there, and they're posted once they're. I've read too much. I can't read anymore. I've lost the skill. I'm glad you've been enjoying it. I hope you enjoy the VODs once they're posted, and I'm also looking forward to a half-Earth socialism stream. Like, there's lots of stuff in there that is kind of pointing towards things that I haven't really investigated yet, so I'm really keen to do it on stream with chat, because I know that a lot of chatters will, like, know what things are being referenced or have, like, more to, like, help shape my understanding of what's going on in the game, so I think that'll be really, really fun. I have played it, like, through a couple of times already, and I think it's, like, it's a really, really solid, fun kind of exercise to help us envision the end of capitalism before the end of the world. Una and Luna says, example, I want to make a thing with wood, but I don't have the space or resources to have a workshop. And even if I did, I couldn't use it all the time. Exactly. If we could act in cooperation without the need to work to live, then we could put so many, we could make such more joyful decisions about how to spend our time. And we wouldn't have to turn every hobby into a job, which is the worst. Having to simply turn every single, like, hobby or academic exploration, right? These mathematicians, in order to get together and study maths, they have to make careers out of mathematics. Yeah, Saline says, I also think that sort of relationship with work, where a society sees value in them living within it and not their production value, inspires people to engage in work in a less menial manner. I feel like people miss that capitalism can disincentivize workers through alienation. Absolutely, absolutely. And that's very much what he's saying here as well. Responding to the idea that workers would just do nothing post-capitalism. Absolutely, people would, like, would enjoy just finding, like, more fun, better, like, more engaging, exciting ways of doing things. And if the more like enjoyable, like socially beneficial way of doing something would actually be to slow down and do less of it, then they'll do that. And if it's just speed up and do it as fast as they can, then sometimes that'll be done, you know, if people want to, if people need to. Blake Toad, my pronouns are she, her. Thank you for asking. Do remember, if good timing. MSS stream has tip, thank you so much. And if anyone else is enjoying the stream and would like to contribute to the stream, you can tip, you can tip, you can subscribe, you can cheer, you can do all those lovely things. That would make me very, very happy and contribute to my birthday, which is at the end of the month. All right. Under these conditions, creative minds and scientific aptitudes would no longer be wasted due to accidents of birthplace, the bad luck of challenging circumstances, oh, I don't know what my voice is doing now, or the necessity to survive. Funding for research or art would also no longer be determined by the profit motive or dictated by the interests of the wealthy. What we call capital in the society of scarcity would, in post-scarcity, be recognized for what it is, our common social inheritance, built up over generations, belonging to no one and to everyone. It is that without which no one could achieve their larger goals or even imagine them. How would people gain access to the resources they need to pursue their passions? Presumably, many of these would be best developed within the realm of freedom itself, through voluntary associations and federation among them. At first, one might imagine the realm of necessity to be the one most like a capitalist economy, with its attendant pressures to raise productivity, reduce labour time, and relocate resources. However, in the absence of market compulsions, it is more likely that the realm of necessity would change slowly by adapting innovations from the realm of freedom. The practical implementation of those innovations might take a long time, since the rush to implement changes in process would no longer be enforced by market competition, but instead would need to be decided through coordination among various committees, some of which might be more concerned with simply getting their work done than with doing it better. There would be no built-in growth trajectory, no need to grow for growth's sake, especially given that most labours of necessity would be services whose productivity is difficult to raise without sacrificing quality. In that case, the realm of freedom would be the one giving rise to all manner of dynamism. That is where human beings would invent new tools, instruments, and methods of accounting, as well as new games and gadgets, rapidly reallocating resources over time and space to suit changing human tastes. Since within the realm of freedom, participation in any given association would be voluntary, no one would need to keep doing what they had been doing on the sole basis of survival. People would only do what they wanted to do. The world would then be composed of overlapping partial plans, which interrelate necessary and free activities, rather than a single central plan. But these issues, as well as the related question of what counts as necessity and what as freedom, would be matters for a freed humanity to resolve for itself, politically. Within this framework, one could imagine fully capacitated individuals arranging themselves in all sorts of ways. People might live in large communities or small ones. They might do a lot of work or a little, choosing instead to explore nature, society, their minds, the oceans, or the stars. They might be happy on a hot planet or a cool one, or in a world of relative resource scarcity or abundance, as long as certain fundamental conditions of sustainable material security were met. The first thing people would actually do in a post-security world, alongside ensuring everyone's basic needs were met, would be to put a large portion of humanity's collective resources and intelligence to work to mitigate or reverse climate change, and to make up for the centuries of inequity that followed colonization. The point of this exercise is to show that it is possible to design utopian thought experiments that revolve around and prioritize people rather than technological progress. Recognition of the fundamental dignity of the 7 billion plus who make up humanity requires that we no longer agree to relegate some to a life of drudgery so that others may be free. It means we must share out the work that remains to be done in a technologically advanced society so that everyone has the right and the power to decide what to do with their time. This brief sketch of a post-scarcity world can perhaps serve as a benchmark to evaluate the various pathways that are supposed to get us to that place. From this standpoint, it is clear that nothing about our world's present organization will automatically lead there. Economic growth never frees us from the need to grow more. Life expectancies, education levels, and degrees of urbanization have risen dramatically over time, yet remain highly unequal in their respective distributions. Meanwhile, even in the richest countries, most people are so atomized, materially insecure, and alienated from their collective capacities that their horizons are stunted. If full automation can appear as both a dream and a nightmare, that is because it has no innate association with human dignity, and because it will not generate a post-scarcity world by itself. Nor will universal basic income. Perhaps if access to education and healthcare were dramatically widened, communities revitalized through cooperative sharing of the work necessary to their reproduction, industries partially socialized, and massive investment made in the transition from fossil fuel to renewable sources of energy, then a basic income could form one part of a larger project aiming at human freedom. But the path to a post-scarcity world could also take some other form entirely. Without a clear vision of this coming world, it is easy to get lost along the way. That was chapter 6. Well done us. We read the 6 chapters, and now we're going to read the postscript. Yes. Yes. Look at us go reading a whole book. Reading a whole book. We can do that. Postscript, agents of change. If neither technological advancement nor technocratic reform leads inevitably to a post-scarcity world, then it is only the pressure of social movements, pushing for a radical restructuring of social life, that can bring it about. One of the most disappointing aspects of the automation discourse is its tendency to underrate existing social struggles. In their 1985, A Capitalist Road to Communism, Robert van der Veen and Philippe van Parijs suppose that as rapid labor-saving technical change, combined with constraints on economic growth, rational human action could be relied upon to generate sooner or later forces that demand and implement social change. Writing 30 years later, Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams despair of the forces that have been generated, which they describe as mere folk politics. People are reacting to the increasing complexity of the modern world, they say, by demanding a return to the simplicity of local communities and engagement in face-to-face interactions. To despair of the emancipatory potential of today's social struggles is not unreasonable. It would take a massive and persistent mobilization to turn the tide of a truculent neoliberalism. Yet the only movement with the size and strength to undertake this task, the historic labour movement, has been thoroughly defeated. Today, strikes and labour demonstrations are mainly defensive. Workers fight to slow the pace of capital's juggernaut and its drive for more austerity, labour flexibility and privatisation in response to an economic slowdown that never ends but does get worse. The labour movement has never figured out how to respond to technologically induced job loss under conditions of slowing economic growth. As economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck put it, disorganized capitalism is disorganizing not only itself, but its opposition as well. For this reason, the long descent into economic stagnation has not been accompanied by a renewal of mass working class organizations. Nevertheless, in the years since the 2008 crisis, this political stasis has shown signs of cracking. Social struggles have unfolded on a scale not seen for decades. There have been waves of strikes and social movements across 6 continents, from China and Hong Kong to Algeria, Iraq and Lebanon, from Argentina and Chile to France and Greece, and from Australia and Indonesia to the United States, with mass protests erupting again worldwide in 2019. Masses of people have once again joined work stoppages, occupations, blockades, riots, and demonstrations, protesting against the symptoms of a long-term decline in the demand for labour, including rising inequality, employment insecurity, government corruption, and austerity measures, as well as food, energy, and transportation price hikes. Protesters have come out en masse in response to murders at the hands of the police, which sparked the rage of racialized communities who would no longer stand for their lack of social recognition. To be sure, these explosive movements have so far lacked the staying power to force recalcitrant governments into retreat, and they have suffered reversals and defeats. But they have nevertheless broadened political horizons and radicalized a new generation of militants. Since this book was written, the largest strikes ever happened in India, with 200,000 farmers on strike at once. Like, things have and are changing very, very rapidly, because we're seeing decline without end in the face of climate change. So we've got to do something about it. But they have nevertheless broadened political horizons and radicalized a new generation of militants. Perhaps our era is like the mid-19th century, not only because it has produced utopian visionaries, but also because it has generated new constituencies for emancipatory social change. Objective features of the past decade support this hypothesis. Ours has been the most broadly educated, most urban, and most connected population in world history. As journalist Paul Mason notes, literate, mobile people will not accept a future of high inequality and stagnant growth on a planet with rising sea levels. Whether this will bring us closer to a freer future is an open question. In early 2020, the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic temporarily halted the globalization of social struggles, but with the simultaneous onset of a deep global recession, they are now beginning to resurge. What is certain is that if these social movements take hold as more permanent formations, they are unlikely to look like the labour movements of earlier centuries. Vast discontinuities separate our era from theirs. Those labour movements arose during a long period of industrialisation, whereas we live in the post-industrial doldrums. Ours will be a struggle over the consequences of industrialisation's end. This is not to deny the global economy's continuing dependence on industrial production, or on the ongoing existence of factory workers, but the declining share of manufacturing in total employment means that these workers no longer have the capacity to cast themselves as representatives of a more just and rational future order. Even countries like South Africa, South Korea, and Brazil, which industrialized only recently, and where manufacturing workers were pivotal in the struggles for democracy of the 1970s and 80s, have long become majority service sector economies. This change in the composition of the labour force will reshape social movements today in essential respects. Though the automation discourse tends to overemphasise this trend, it is true that direct human labour plays a much smaller role in the core industries than it did before. As Marx predicted, it has largely been displaced as the primary productive force by scientific and technical knowledge, embodied in vast infrastructures that mobilise both natural forces and machines. Many workers have been cast aside, forced to give up much of their waking lives to dead-end service jobs, in which labour productivity rises slowly. Therefore, the dynamic struggles that animated earlier generations of workers, those concerning who should benefit from continual productivity growth, fail to take place. For most workers today, capital's compulsion to drive down production costs means only that labour intensifies, without corresponding increases in pay, which does not mean that workplace struggles are not occurring. It is only to say that their determining logics have evidently changed. Some left commentators have argued that however disaffected insecure workers become, they lack the power at the point of production necessary to press their demands. Yet, as it turns out, in a world of lean, just-in-time production, organising to blockade circulation in and around major cities can prove an effective tactic. An early example is the Piquetero movement in Argentina. Beginning in the mid-1990s, unemployed workers blockaded highways around Buenos Aires to demand better benefits. Since 2011, this tactic has been adopted sporadically by workers in the United States, France, Egypt, and elsewhere. In the autonomous spaces that open up in the course of major struggles, movement participants pose questions about the nature and future of society. Assemblies are generally open to all. If personal and intimate forms of coercion are not altogether absent, there is nevertheless a shared sense that everyone deserves a say in social affairs. Within occupations and on the front lines of blockades, people do actually care for one another. They cook and clean and look after the children without expecting anything in return, although they have, of course, generally purchased the materials they use to perform these tasks within the ordinary course of the life they seek to disrupt by such actions. These efforts do not merely indicate a penchant for a simpler life, whether in folk or Volkish terms. Instead, they point, however fitfully, toward a world of generalized human dignity, one with fewer borders and boundaries. No matter how large they become, these protests have so far been unable to escape the limits confronted by all struggles over the collective reproduction of the working class, whose deterioration, under the pressures of stagnating wages, employment insecurity, and welfare state retreat, has been extreme. These movements fail to rise from the level of reproduction to that of production, even when they call forth and combine with strikes in what remains of the industrial core. However much hope they inspire amid the catastrophe of the present, the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic notwithstanding, disruptive protests in our era have so far lacked a vision of a wholly different world. in which the infrastructures of capitalist societies are brought under collective control. Work is reorganized and redistributed. Scarcity is overcome through the free giving of goods and services, and our human capacities are correspondingly enlarged as new vistas of existential security and freedom open up. Unless social struggles organize themselves around this historic task, the conquest of production, they will not break through to a new synthesis of what it means to be a human being, to live in a world devoid of poverty and billionaires, of stateless refugees and detention camps, and of lives spent in drudgery which hardly offer a moment to rest, let alone dream. Movements without a vision are blind, but visionaries without movements are much more severely incapacitated. Without a massive social struggle to build a post-scarcity world, late capitalist visionaries will remain mere techno-utopian mystics. And that is the end of this whole ass book that we've read. Everyone give themselves a big pat on the back. We just read a whole book. That was fun. That was fun, wasn't it? I thought that was pretty good. I thought that was extremely solid, in fact. Anyway, here's what I've been thinking, okay? You know, chime in with this. Whatever you think about this. What I've been thinking is that everyone I know, most of the people I know are renting their homes, and most of the people who are renting their homes are paying like 2/3 of their income in rent. Sometimes more. And you know, when you're renting a house, like, you're already inside it. I just feel like, as far as like efficacy versus risk at like saving the fucking planet from global warming and also ourselves from the burden of capitalism, like, getting together to not pay rent would remove, like, you know, like 2/3 of the burden on our life of like labor and income that we could choose to withdraw from the sovereignty of capital, or to share our time or our incomes if we continue to work for the foreseeable to build something new, rather than just pass money from the ruling class, gets passed down to us, and then we pass it back up to the ruling class, to our landlord. You know, reverse the enclosures, right? Reverse the enclosures. The land is what they took from us in the first place in order to force us to labor for them, and it doesn't even make them happy. So let's just stop that, right? We gotta figure it out. We gotta figure it out, guys, how to not pay rent. And what else I've been thinking is that in the UK, like, I'm like, everyone's right that the UK is like one of the most bootlicking populations, because we've been effectively disciplined through through centuries of extreme violence, and genocidal violence, and then through, you know, neoliberal politics to internalize and accept that discipline, to the extent that most of the violence done to the working class is indirect rather than direct interpersonal violence through policing and bosses, and which means that we have like a unique moment of like safety to act, right? Versus what came before and what comes next. You know, not so many countries in the imperial core have been cutting their police budgets, right? There's just loads more of us, right? And we can stay in our homes, and we can declare that they're ours, and we can fight for each other to do that, and we can fight to free each from the vicious claws of capital. That's my little bit. I'm working on it anyway. I've been thinking big brain communist thoughts. Thank you, Locesius, so much for tipping the stream. And if anybody else has been enjoying reading this whole ass book with me, I've enjoyed it so much. If anybody else fancies contributing to the stream so we can do more stuff like this, and I'm gonna come back and play Half-Earth Socialism soon, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you all for hanging around whilst I read that, because I do have the old ADHD. It is a struggle for me to focus on reading the important texts and the less important texts, and it's always a pleasure to have people to read to encourage me to do that. So I really appreciate it. I appreciate everyone sticking around for that. That's been really fun. All right. Book read. Well done, us. I am going to head off and enjoy the rest of my evening. Let you all do the same. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around. Thank you so much to everybody who donated or subscribed. Wonderful little chatters. This has been really fun and really cool. It's really cool to be able to just I think that book was extremely solid. There was nothing that I was like, what's that? Or like questioning in there. That's just extremely solid, and I'm very much seeing how it was such an important kind of text for Soph in working on The World Is Not Ending. Recommend it to your friends. Seriously, this was a short book. I read this in 2 streams, right? This is a short book. Recommend this book to your friends. Recommend it to your mom, you know? Recommend it to your mom. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.